What's the first thing that pops into my mind when I think of the 80s?
This is like a VH1 segment.
I mean, we all had mullets. We all had, those stupid shirts and tight shorts.
My prom. It sucked. Sorry, Rochelle.
Work your tail off. 5 seconds left. 4, you dreamer. 3, 4.
Ah, the 80s, when greed was good. We did the wave, wore members-only jackets, and had wacky haircuts.
Look at my hair. Do you think I could have ever gone flock of seagulls at any point in my life? The 80s, for the most part, was embarrassing from beginning to end.
Today, some products of the 80s are a little dated, but some will always look good.
I just think about balls in the air, throwing the football.
In the 80s, the passing game was the choice of a new generation.
And boy, did he rip a beauty, a perfect pass to Jerry Rice.
A top 10 quarterback of the 80s must have talent, stats, rings, intangibles, or some combination of the four. The catch? We're only considering what happened in the 80s.
This one's for John.
Sorry, John. Wait till you get a load of our list. These are our top 10 quarterbacks of the 1980s.
The number 10 quarterback of the 80s, Jim McMahon.
Jim McMahon is a top 10 guy for 80s quarterbacks for so many obvious reasons. I mean, the guy had his own fashion sense.
Jim McMahon was a consummate punk. I mean, he was everything that you don't really see in a quarterback. He totally was this anti-establishment guy and loved every minute of it.
I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm also going to market myself that way, saying screw it to the establishment and cashing in market-wise. McMahon absolutely did that. The whole Bears team did that.
Outrageousness. It's nothing more than a way to wake people up, especially yourself.
He walked into Hallis Hall the day after he was drafted, chewing tobacco, pair of sunglasses, and a beer in his hand. Sat down next to George Hallis. George Hallis scratched his head going, "Is this the guy?"
The guy at number 10 on our list was a breath of fresh air in the Windy City. In the mid-80s, Jim McMahon won 22 straight games, a record that stood until Peyton Manning broke it in 2009.
McMahon looking to deal. He fires the left side of the end zone.
The way McMahon did it made him a leader.
He was one tough SOB, and it was almost like he should be playing defense. He wanted to have that defensive mentality.
His teammates loved him, and he had this kind of crazy attitude where he was headbutting everybody.
The O-linemen bought into the fact that they had an O-lineman behind them. The defense bought into the fact that that was a defender really at quarterback. He was the head of a gang.
He thought he was a linebacker, and he would get his little butt tore to pieces, boy.
All he had to do was the baseball slide, but he said, I want to get that couple extra yards. I think it was his passion and his competitiveness that ended up being his downfall.
If he would have stayed healthy, we'd have won 2 more Super Bowls.
Unfortunately, the injury bug took a big bite out of Big Mac's game, leaving some of our experts to ask, where's the beef?
There was too many times when he couldn't answer the bell for me to rate him as one of the top quarterbacks.
One of the real things that people forget about Jim McMahon is he wasn't any good. And that seems like that should be probably something that people would remember about him, but they don't. They remember putting the headband on. He brought leadership and all those sorts of things, which basically meant he handed the ball off to Walter Payton a lot.
The better list would have been the top 10 quarterbacks that would not have won a Super Bowl with the 1985 Bears. David Archer, Mike Pagel. I mean, I'm going down the list here. I can't think of many others. Maybe Joey Harrington, but, he was like 4 years old. Come on, he does not need to be on this list.
Jim McMahon would have been healthy. He would not be 10th on that list. He'd be in the top 3, along with a guy like Joe Montana.
Wasn't that fun?
Coming up,
You know, he looked like an ostrich running in quicksand at times.
He almost looked a little bit gangly and awkward in his own body.
Really a bizarre-looking quarterback.
Which 80s ugly duckling was a beautiful swan to his home fans? The answer is next. Before we get back to our list, here are some quarterbacks that didn't crack the top 10.
Randall now rolling with the football and being flattened at the 10, but throwing the ball to Giles for a touchdown.
Oh, Randall Cunningham has to be on the list. He's the guy that started that dual threat type of quarterback.
I think it's just terrible that you do not have Randall Cunningham on there. The ultimate weapon.
But Randall threw for fewer yards in the decade than Mark Wilson and Richard Todd. And he wasn't even the best Eagles quarterback of the 80s. Then there's Ron Jaworski's division rival with over 21,000 yards and 150 touchdowns.
Danny White had the great misfortune of following Roger Staubach, and Danny White was very, very good for quite a few years, but he could never get over the hump.
I think Danny White probably belongs on the list. That's a tough one for me. I don't know why Danny White isn't on the list.
White didn't make the list, but a Brown did. A Brown who, like White, lost 3 conference title games.
Number 9 quarterback of the 80s, Bernie Kosar.
Hello, I'm Bernie Kosar, and I'm honored to be the People's Choice for this year's Gillette NFL MVP Award.
You look back on that decade, if you don't talk about Kosar as being in the mix of one of the greatest, then you're not talking about a real list.
Accurate quarterback, threw for a lot of yards, 3 AFC championship games in 4 seasons, awesome perm. He absolutely needs to be on this list.
Just to be in the conversation and to be part of that group, I consider it a heck of a compliment.
Kosar was not a specimen of any type. You look like you'd go in a bar in Lakewood and pluck him out and put him on the field.
If Red Grange was the galloping ghost, Bernie Kosar was the galloping goat.
More like a duck. I mean, Bernie was he was geriatric before his time.
We pity the fool that emulated Bernie Kosar's mechanics.
Bernie Kosar had the most unorthodox throwing motion of any quarterback in history, but Bernie got the ball there. He had great touch.
I always remember him at the quarterback challenge where he's throwing the ball right through the tire every single time.
Kosar was so accurate, and that's what no one could believe.
It wasn't always pretty, but Bernie got the job done.
The Cleveland Browns won 62% of the games Kosar started in the 80s.
Kosar's been maligned for being a so-called ugly quarterback, but beauty is definitely in the eyes of the beholder.
People often talked about how he was slow of foot and how his delivery took so long, but what you learn watching Bernie Kosar excel and achieve was he was a quick-minded quarterback, and quick-minded is better than quick-footed.
He used to go and tell Lindy and Fonnie and Marty Schottenheimer what needed to be done and how the offense should be run.
Bernie had the latitude to make changes in the plays that were being called.
Hey, Bernie, I know talent when I see it. I haven't spent much time talking to you about it because I can't do anything to help you. You're going to do it yourself.
And it became very apparent that he had the ability to do that, and so we afforded him that opportunity.
He could read a defense as well, if not better, than any quarterback in the National Football League.
It's time to move forward from here now. We still haven't accomplished our goal yet.
Our number 9 quarterback turned the Browns into winners, but his nightmare was on Elway Street.
And the Broncos have gone 98 yards.
You talk about playoff disappointment. Nobody had it more than Bernie.
If it hadn't have been for John Elway, what could Bernie Kosar have accomplished?
To me, he's Charlie Brown. The football always gets pulled away by Lucy just as he's about to kick it. He doesn't get the Elway ending. He gets the Bernie Kosar ending.
Oh, my goodness. Doesn't seem fair.
I have a lot of empathy for guys who come in seconds. Did I give us a chance to win? Yeah, I did. But did we come up short? Yeah. Did it kill me at the time? Absolutely.
I don't think Bernie will be remembered for his failures because in the eyes of a lot of Browns fans, they didn't lose because of Bernie Kosar.
quarterback of the 80s, Dave Craig.
Never heard of him. Did Dave Craig play in the NFL? Or was that the World League?
Really? Dave Craig and Jim McMahon? Who are we missing in here, bro? Randall Cunningham was better than those guys.
Dave Craig may be the 90th best quarterback, not the top 10.
Was he in the NFL? For real? Never heard of him.
Dave Craig had the kind of career that kind of just blends into the scenery. I would challenge you, give me one highlight moment from Dave Craig's career. I can't remember any.
I would challenge Don Banks to tell me if he's ever been to Seattle.
He slipped away from Thomas. Craig back, throws it. One in the end zone. Touchdown. Touchdown Seahawks.
Lofton in the end zone. Touchdown Seahawks for Largent.
A lot of people don't really look at David Craig because he played in Seattle, and I think Seattle is just west of the Hawaiian Island.
84-85, ground chuck. All they do is run. Dave Craig throws for 7,400 yards in those 2 seasons and 59 touchdowns. Pretty good for a ground-based offense.
What's this thing about Chuck Knotts being conservative? Somebody once said, ground what?
Check his career statistics. They're better than most of the quarterbacks who are in the Hall of Fame. He was short, and he played on a team that only went to the playoffs a couple of times, but statistically, he was one of the finest passers ever.
Chargers rush only 4. Craig goes with a pass in the end zone. Touchdown Seahawks.
Dave Craig is kind of a compiler. He has a lot of good stats, but I don't know if he belongs on your list.
When you really look at his numbers and when you look at what he did for the Seattle organization, I think he has every right to be on this list.
Craig kind of turned that franchise around, and he was a good player. I think he still fumbled more than anybody else, didn't he?
When our number 8 quarterback left the game, no quarterback had been sacked more and no quarterback had fumbled more.
David Craig is just one fumble away from the NFL record of all time.
I remember Dave Craig as being the best quarterback in the NFL to sack.
Good quarterback, good arm. The problem is small hands equals lots of fumbles.
I think it's because I got hit a lot. I think it's because if you get hit hard enough, you're going to fumble the ball. So I don't think it has nothing to do with small hands.
What you talking about, Willis? Dave Craig is just one of 10 quarterbacks to throw for over 20,000 yards in the 80s, and his 169 touchdown passes ranks 4th in the decade.
Came out of nowhere, came out of Milton College in Wisconsin.
A college that doesn't even exist today. It's not that they got rid of their football program, they got rid of the whole college.
Well, Craig currently is the 2nd highest rated passer in the AFC, and he's done Milton proud.
Craig never said no mas. The poster boy for perseverance ended up in 3 Pro Bowls.
The very first one in 1984, I got voted into that thing with Marino and myself. I'm like, Dan Marino and Dave Craig from Milton College? I'm going to the Pro Bowl?
Dave just had an ability to make plays. He could see things on the field that nobody else could see. Dave found a way to pull a rabbit out of his hat again and again and again.
Craig fumbles the snap. There's a scramble for it. Nearly fielded by Durant. Craig gets it back of the 20.
Here's a guy that was maybe 6 foot tall and not particularly fast. Didn't have a particularly strong arm. I think Dave should be really proud of the career that he had.
Up next,
big, tall, strapping, blonde bomber.
Madonna wasn't the only blonde ambition on tour in the 80s.
Icebreakers Mints.
Before we resume our list, here are some QBs who didn't crack the 80s ranks.
Throwing for Tony Jones. Yeah!
Little surprise Warren Moon did not make the list. Look what he did in Houston. Revitalize that franchise.
But his best years came in the 90s, and Moon isn't the only star left off our list. Ken Anderson won an MVP and took his team to a Super Bowl. And Jim Plunkett's 8-2 playoff record was second best in the decade.
How do you have a guy win 2 Super Bowls in a 10-year period not make the list of quarterbacks?
For Jim Plunkett not to be on the list is kind of crazy. Maybe they're thinking he should be on the list of the 70s.
Plunkett didn't make it, but the guy he beat in Super Bowl 18 did.
The number 7 quarterback of the 80s, Joe Theismann.
I'm sure Joe would quibble with 7.
I'm sure it's number 1 for Joe.
In a city of hogs, our number 7 quarterback of the 80s oinked the loudest and loved hamming for the camera.
With the AE1, it's easy to shoot like a pro. The incomparable Canon AE1.
Everybody knows Joe Theismann was a moth. You know, the TV lights went on and he was there.
Joe Theismann could be in a room talking and talking and talking.
You look at the Redskins, you say, my gosh, they've changed over 32 players in the last 2 years. They're under a new coaching staff. They've got this kid that talks too much as a quarterback sometimes.
And no one had to be in that room. I mean, Joe could have a conversation with Joe.
I was perceived as a cocky, egotistical little pain in the ass.
You know, it's amazing. Virgil's the smallest guy on the ball club. He's the only guy sitting down watching the game.
I wasn't a popular guy, I guess you could say.
Theismann's mouth wrote a lot of checks, but he won respect by proving his body could cash them.
He's wearing the single bar face mask. He wasn't afraid to get in there and mix it up and throw a block on a sweep.
He got a block from Theismann.
He was a tough quarterback.
I have to go to the dentist, Jack. That one blitz that came from the right side knocked my 2 front teeth out. You want to zoom in on him here? Bring in the camera. I'll show you.
There goes his TV career.
Let's go spread right, low 11 hinge.
All right.
Joe Gibbs really helped Joe Theismann. For 3 or 4 years, Joe Theismann was really, really good.
Pass ends up.
In 1982, Theismann was great. The number 7 quarterback on our list led the Redskins to Super Bowl 17.
Garrett's there. Touchdown. The Washington Redskins have an NFL championship.
Unfortunately, even great leaders in Washington have term limits. In 1985, Theismann's leg suffered America's worst break since David Lee Roth split up with Van Halen.
Good quarterback till Lawrence Taylor broke his leg. Boy, that was beautiful. Did you see that?
We've seen a lot of Theismann since then. The injury forced him in front of the camera for good.
Shouldn't be this high on the list. Classic case of we remember him as a lot better of a quarterback because of his broadcasting career. We see you every weekend. We see you every Sunday or Monday night. We think you were a lot better than you were.
There may be some Theismann fatigue. Some would say a little bit of Joe goes a long way.
There's a little animosity towards him sometimes. He was a better player than a lot of people gave him credit for, so he probably should be a little higher on that list.
It's hard to move him up much higher than 7, given that he only played 4.5 years of that decade.
Joe had a stretch where he played as well as anybody, but it wasn't a 10-year stretch, and that's probably where he's going to get ranked down some.
I'm flattered and honored. And it's funny that it's the number 7. It's the number I wore. To be at 7, I guess, is appropriate. Curious to see who the 6 are ahead of me.
Number 6 quarterback of the 80s, Boomer Esiason.
Top 10 quarterbacks of the 80s.
Number 6.
Boomer Esiason's number 6. Well, he shouldn't be even in the top 10. He never won a Super Bowl.
Into the end zone. Touchdown to Taylor.
Boomer never won a Super Bowl, and you got him ranked above Joey T. I don't think Joey's going to like that at all.
I don't know why Boomer Esiason is ranked ahead of me.
It's a shame that everybody attaches a Super Bowl victory to coach's success, or in my case, a quarterback success.
No rings to speak of, but a lot of victories, a lot of yards, touchdowns. One of the top guys during the 1980s.
He came into the league with a chip on his shoulder, a second-round draft pick. He thought he was going to be a top 10 pick.
I was very upset that I was not a first-round draft pick, and when I think back to that time, I think partly was my personality was to blame.
What kind of call is that? It's like we gave up on that.
The sharp-tongued lefty from Maryland actually benefited from his draft day slip. It paired him with Bengals head coach Sam Weish.
Nutty professor meets freewheeling quarterback.
They worked well together because Boomer could come over to Sam and he could say, "You're an idiot. That's not going to work."
Should have passed it.
Once he finally got me refined in the way he wanted me, I think the proof is in the performance.
There's a man down there, Eddie Brown. He may go.
Our number 6 quarterback threw for over 18,000 yards in the decade, piloting an offense the likes the NFL had never seen.
Stand move it. No, strong right. Boomer Esiason ran the NFL's first true hurry-up, no-huddle offense.
Rod Holman, touchdown.
It was genius, and it was fun to watch. It was fast break football.
Touchdown. Out end zone, grabbed by Eddie Brown.
he excelled because he was very quick on his feet. The more experience he got in the league, the more able he was to read defenses on the fly.
This guy thinks ahead. He's always anticipating what's coming next.
He's one of those photographic memory type guys who knew the game so well.
Shoot. 58G release. All right. 647 bend in.
Boomer Esiason had football IQ that was second to none. He was Mensa.
He had the brain and the arm. He also had a mouth as big as Pac-Man.
Attack! Attack! Let's go! Let's go! Attack! The way to go! Oh!
Boomer Esiason's ego was as big as the outdoors, you know?
I think quarterbacks have to have that about themselves. They have to say, I'm the best guy.
What a great fake by Boomer. Oh, did that fake out that secondary completely.
One of the best ever at running the play fake, Boomer won MVP honors in 1988. It was the only hardware he took home that year.
Obviously, Boomer that close to winning it all.
34 seconds away.
I think if he had won Super Bowl 23, he probably would be a little bit higher.
But Boomer being number 6 is good. He shouldn't be in the top 5 because it goes right to his head.
Coming up, which beast of the NFC East makes our list the most magical place on earth?
I'm going to go to Disneyland. All these people thinking, what the is he doing?
Before we get back to our countdown, let's recap our list, 80s style.
You're trying for $10,000. Good luck. Here's your first subject. Go.
Number 10. Warhead Band, Super Bowl Shuffle.
Jim McMahon.
Number 9. Through Funny, Lost to Elway.
Bernie Kosar.
Number 8. Played in Seattle.
Jim Zorn.
No. Pass.
Pass.
Number 7. Single bar face mask. LT broke his leg on a Monday night.
Joe Theismann.
Number 6. Lefty. Blonde.
Boomer Esiason.
Yes. Back to number 8. Seattle quarterback sacked a lot.
Oh, hit Dave Craig.
You got it. Now, number 5 quarterback of the 80s, Phil Simms.
The quarterback is the leader of the offense. He's the one that calls the signals that sets the play in motion.
In the 80s, Phil Simms wasn't comfortable in front of the camera, but felt right at home in the pocket. During the decade, he was one of only 10 quarterbacks to throw for over 4,000 yards in a season.
People have the wrong impression about Phil Simms, that it was all running the football, all defense.
I think Phil Simms should be much higher. Phil Simms was not a babysitter quarterback like a Trent Dilfer or Brad Johnson. He made a lot of key plays for the New York Football Giants.
Sam's touchdown,
I think he's ranked about right. I really do. He was incredible in an unbelievably windy environment.
Rolls of toilet paper, pieces of cutout program, newspapers, pouring down like a blizzard on Giant Stadium.
What people don't realize is how difficult it is to put up numbers in that stadium.
When you watch Simms in some of those really windy playoff games the Giants played, he was very accurate and had a very tight spiral.
Simms looking at zone, lobs in, complete touchdown.
So why is Simms only number 5 on our list? He arrived in New York with Luke Skywalker hair, but wasn't exactly a Jedi master.
New York Giants first-round selection. Quarterback Phil Simms, Morehead State.
That's automatically putting him on the griddle. Who is this guy? Forget about it. Morehead State? I've never heard of that place. Boy, did he stink up the joint to start.
Phil Simms had several down seasons in the 80s. I mean, New York didn't even really embrace him.
Simms is hearing some sounds he doesn't like.
Phil Simms 5th? I mean, that's ridiculous, right? Everybody's basing that on one game.
Simms survived New York and thrived in Super Bowl 21. He went 22 for 25 with 3 touchdown passes, a performance worthy of an 80s sports movie montage.
Hey, fellas, what's the point you lift all that weight?
To have that kind of efficiency in a championship moment is really special. for whatever reason, it doesn't get recognized the way it should. But Phil Simms is a Hall of Famer.
Come on, Eileen. Do we have Simms ranked right at number 5? Or should he be as high as 2? Ralu Rae.
There is no way that this guy is the 5th best quarterback of the 80s.
People don't understand how good Phil Simms was.
He was a winner. He kept winning.
It's a shame.
I don't understand why Theismann's behind a couple of those guys. He should absolutely be ahead of Simms. I think Theismann's body of work was superior. He was a better quarterback than Phil Simms.
I think I could justifiably be at 5. But of course you would expect that from me, wouldn't you?
The number 4 quarterback of the 80s, John Elway.
4. We can say, oh, well, you can't count the Super Bowl wins because that happened in the 90s, but my brain's not going to let me do that. I know he won the Super Bowls later on. I know it. It makes all the that he did in the 80s much more impressive.
Well, we can only consider the stuff John Elway did in the 80s. He used his arm and legs to climb to number 4 on our list.
John Elway was one of the first quarterbacks to bring athleticism to the position and make it as important as the ability to throw the football.
Nobody could do on the field as much as John Elway. He had a gun of an arm.
That thing was another blue darter. That was a Rich Gossage fastball right down the heart of the plate.
He could hurt you with his legs as well.
That's where John Elway can do it on his own.
John Elway's awesome. I'm wondering who's number 3 and 2.
Red Black, let's fire 62. Option left, shoot in on 1-on-1. Hurry up!
You always think of John Wayne.
You can say what you want to. I don't think I want anybody back there except number 7.
And then Gate tells you that he's the quarterback, that he's in charge.
20-13 in favor of Cleveland. Let's see what happens here as this one ticks down to its final moment.
98 yards. Right down the field in Cleveland.
Elway threaded the needle for 22 yards.
He was the scariest presence in those last minutes of any quarterback of that time. You just knew he was going to beat you.
Touchdown, Mark Jackson.
I hate John Elway.
This guy will go down as the greatest come-from-behind player in National Football League history.
I think you can make a pretty strong argument that he was the best player of that decade.
So why is Elway only 4th on our list of 80s quarterbacks? Well, you can't make great comebacks without first falling behind.
1980s John Elway ran around too much. He overthrew receivers. 1980s John Elway, he's right about on par with Phil Simms.
John Elway fit perfectly at a time when ESPN was becoming popular. In the 80s, John Elway was a highlight quarterback.
Broncos get the 22-yard touchdown the hard way.
Elway would make these great individual plays, but he was not a consistent quarterback through the 80s.
Elway and the Broncos were consistently bad in Super Bowls, going 0 for 3 in the 80s.
Considering who's on the list, I think 4 is pretty fair. You're making all these comebacks, a lot of great runs, but at the end of the day, you're not winning the big game.
There were 21 other guys who were crapping the bed the same time he was.
No good. Okay defenses, no running games, and who were starting wide receivers? The 3 amigos. Vance Johnson, Ricky Nattiel, Mark Jackson.
He got those Broncos teams to those early Super Bowls. If it hadn't been for him, they would not have gotten there.
Our number 4 quarterback of the 80s was huge in Japan. But will our experts put Elway in his place?
John Elway, there's an argument made he could be number 1 or number 2.
John Elway is the best quarterback to ever play the game of football. This is not arguable. This is not up for debate.
But I thought he was a great quarterback in the 80s. Was he the best? No.
Anybody argues that, don't even put him on.
Please remain seated. The top 3 are on the way.
He was great in 2 decades. I think you could put him in either one.
What 2-decade star was good enough to beat out Elway? The answer is ahead.
The Canadian Football League is back.
The 1980s produced some all-time quarterbacks, but the numbers produced pale when compared to today. In 2009, 10 quarterbacks topped 4,000 yards passing. Only 10 reached the milestone in the entire decade of the 80s. And they include names like Lynn Dickey, Neil Lomax, Don Majkowski, Jay Schrader, and Bill Kenny.
Quarterbacks that threw for 300 yards in a game, more than often than not in those days, were on the losing side because they were
passing at the end of the game, trying to get back in the game and picking up some cheap yards.
At number 3 on our list, the founding member of the decade's 4,000-yard club.
The number 3 quarterback of the 80s, Dan Fouts.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Air Coryell and your pilot, Dan Fouts, welcome to San Diego.
When you talk about the statistical measurement of a quarterback, who is better than this guy for such a long run in the 80s?
Steps up under pressure, throwing deep to Joyner. Touchdown, Chargers!
That's a tough call, Dan Fouts ahead of John Elway.
Yellow 19!
Elway was dragging a corpse of a franchise around during the 80s and gets them to 3 Super Bowls. Fouts brings his squads to 0. Fouts is on this list. He's a top 4 guy, but Elway's got to be ahead of him. Elway was the better 1980s quarterback.
Quit your bitching!
If it's for the career, absolutely not. If it's for the decade, yeah, Dan Fouts belongs ahead of John Elway, no question at all.
And when I think back to Dan Fouts playing with a bloodied nose and blood all over his jersey and a torn groin.
He was a tough quarterback in an era of tough quarterbacks.
For a quarterback to show toughness is important because it shows the other guys, hey, if he can do it, we can do it.
Fouts was as tough as Rubik's Cube. He was also tough on his teammates.
Come on, run out of the brakes now! Lead it on! Run out of the brake!
He expected, perfection from everybody. And when you didn't do those things, he would tell you.
You run out of the brake. I'm running out the brake! Tippy toeing like a You don't like the final number, damn tight end! I will. And you're out of here. You're out of here.
Dan Fouts wore a hat all week long. MFIC in charge, and he was definitely that.
He didn't have what you would say a classic quarterback's body, and he didn't move around like we see quarterbacks nowadays.
But he did have the look. You could just picture him in Montana or Wyoming just throwing the football at a bear, trying to knock the bear down. He probably could.
He could deliver the pass on the money, even though the rush was completely encircling him and the curtain was about to be dropped on him.
The knock on our number 3 quarterback is that he was a product of a unique system that was loaded with superstars.
Fouts was blessed with great receivers.
The weapons he had with Winslow and Joyner and Chandler and Jefferson, it just went on and on and on.
He'll go far right, 50, belly on blue, ready?
He was the perfect driver for the perfect vehicle here.
I really didn't make myself clear. I think I understood you. Is that what you wanted, a touchdown?
We had a lot of talented people, but Dan pulled it all together. He was the straw that stirred the drink.
The Chargers were not going to be Air Coryell without Dan Fouts.
When we look at the quarterbacking position, I think at the end of the day, we'll always get back to passing yardage and touchdowns and sort of the eye candy that we view.
Fouts was the Pop Rocks of eye candy. His 28,000 passing yards was the second most of the decade. And after the first 2 years of the 80s, he had recorded the 2 top passing seasons in NFL history.
When he threw for 4,000 yards, that was huge. I couldn't believe a quarterback could throw for 4,000 yards.
Dan Fouts changed the history of the National Football League and how teams had to learn to play defense.
He was ahead of his time. I think he was the first of that generation. He made it happen, and I think there's been a lot of quarterbacks that have followed that style since then.
Coming up, who could it be now? Which 2 of these men at work top our list?
These questions are ridiculous.
What's up, Smart?
Oh, just book.
If you talk quarterbacks of the 80s, it's hard to ignore the 1983 draft.
Quarterback John Elway of Stanford. Quarterback Tony Eason. Quarterback Jim Kelly. Ken O'Brien of California Davis. Blackledge, Penn State.
The Chiefs did not find their franchise quarterback in the 83 draft. Todd Blackledge won just 15 games over a 7-year span. Others fared better. Tony Eason took the Patriots to a Super Bowl. Ken O'Brien led the NFL in passer rating in 1985. and Jim Kelly had 3 3,000-yard passing seasons in 4 years.
Jim Kelly started in '86 in Buffalo, and he didn't really become great until the '90s.
At number 2 on our list, the valedictorian of the class of '83.
The number 2 quarterback of the 80s. Number 2. Dan Marino.
Crockett and Tubbs kind of put us on the map in a lot of ways. And then here comes Dan.
Throwing deep upfield down the near side, man open, touchdown!
I think the average fan might say that Marino's too high on the list at number 2. But Dan Marino had one of the greatest arms football's ever seen.
Perfectly thrown pass by Dan Marino.
From the time his brain told him he was going to throw the football, the ball was released quicker than anybody we'd ever seen.
You never really started to hear about a quick release among quarterbacks until Marino came along.
Danny always had big ones, and they were made of brass. He had confidence in the arm.
What you see on that field is what Dan Marino was about. He's blue collar, he's Italian, he's a hugger, he's a crier, he's emotional. He brought that to every huddle.
Let's go. Play with some urgency now.
To every sideline, whether they played at the Orange Bowl or they played in whatever they're calling Joe Robbie Stadium nowadays. Dan Marino brought it. He's real. He deserves to be number 2. He's one of the best of all time.
Dan Marino! This thing is made of steel, folks!
Though our number 2 quarterback of the 80s looked more like Michael Knight than the $6 million man, the way he played represented a quantum leap forward in the game, especially in Miami.
Remember, this is a Dolphin team that won a Super Bowl with Zonka and Morris. This was a whole new style of football.
With the Marino, you were a big play coach. You wanted Dan to have the opportunity to make the big plays that he could make. Here's Marino, wide open field, throws for a touchdown, and there's the record. He has thrown his 37th touchdown pass for the season. That's a new record.
In 1984, Marino set NFL records by throwing for over 5,000 yards and 48 touchdowns. And despite not playing until 1983, his 220 touchdown passes were tops in the decade.
Going deep up the sidelines, got it, touchdown!
They're pinball numbers. They're arena football numbers. They're XFL numbers. If Marino's not 1, he's damn close.
He's going deep, got a man down there. Touchdown!
While Marino was a top gun, he only appeared in 1 Super Bowl during the decade and lost it. Does that mean we're Mavericks for putting him so high on our list?
Dan has all the numbers. He just never won.
For young Dan Marino, his first Super Bowl will be a loss.
He has all the numbers, but he never won. I could say that like a mantra over and over again. Dan didn't win. And there's no way to act like anything else he did could make up for that.
If Dan would have won 1 Super Bowl, he would be the number 1 quarterback.
I think you could make a case for him being lower, but absolutely not higher.
I think Phil Simms should be much higher. He won a Super Bowl. It's natural to say that Dan Marino was great, but Phil Simms stepped up when he needed to and led his team to a Super Bowl.
For those people who believe that great quarterbacking is solely defined by winning Super Bowls, they will never view Dan Marino as truly elite.
Marino, deep drop, throwing deep upfield down the near side, man open, touchdown!
Dan Marino belongs at the top of any list when you talk about great quarterbacks in the 1980s.
The crowd is getting restless.
Who's number 1 on the list?
Be cool. We're getting to the top dog.
Talk about that decade, he's got to be number 1.
And he's not talking about Eric Hipple. Number 1 is coming up.
Some people think also.
Before we phone home number 1, let's recap our list.
6, 5, 4, 3. What the hell happened to 10? Come on, let's play the field.
Top 9 answers on the board. Name the top quarterbacks of the 80s.
Jim McMahon.
And the hot dog. You got it.
Bernie Kosar.
Warren Moon. Jim Plunkett.
I know he played in Seattle. How about Dave Craig?
Show me Mudbone.
Joe Theismann?
Rhymes with Heisman.
Boomer Esiason.
Boomer.
Phil Simms.
Ooh, Elway. John Elway.
Do we have Elway at number 4?
Maybe Dan Fouts?
Air Coryell. Show me Fouts.
I'll say Dan Marino.
Of course, Dan Marino. Now, the number 1 quarterback of the 80s is no surprise.
Oh, the 80s? I would assume it'd be Joe Montana, unless I'm missing something.
Of the 80s? Yeah. Considering in the 80s he was a part of, 4 Super Bowl teams? Fouts was none. Elway was none. Marino was none. None. Was a common theme for the other guys.
At the dawn of the decade, there was little reason to think Joe Montana would ultimately top the list of 80s quarterbacks.
Joe Montana was not viewed as a prototype NFL quarterback. Steve Bartkowski was. 6'4", 230 pounds, stood in the pocket, rocket arm. My guess is Joe Montana was not on very many people's draft boards before the 5th or 6th round.
He wasn't a great player at Notre Dame just by passing through town.
A third-round pick in 1979, Montana led the decade in passing yards, completions, Pro Bowls, and playoff wins.
You'd leave a game and you feel like he never landed a punch, but you lost. You know, he's like hitting you with pillows. He was the artist out there.
Joe was a technician. Not the biggest arm, not the strongest arm, not the fastest guy, but he was an absolute perfectionist and a technician when it came to playing the position of quarterback.
Montana rolling out the right, looking toward the end zone, throwing under pressure, throws his pass, caught by Clark. Clark got a touchdown.
Nobody did it with the ease and the calmness of one Joe Montana.
Here is Montana throwing for the end zone. Late, he got it.
Joe Montana made it look easy. It's not that easy.
Back to throw Montana. Stepped up, throws.
Joe Montana played in 4 Super Bowls. He was MVP 3 times. In those 4 games, he threw 11 touchdowns with 0 interceptions. Joe Montana, when he got to the ultimate game, was literally perfect. There is no other. It's Joe Montana and everybody else.
The Niners were happy to be stuck with Joe. His 86 wins are 21 more than his nearest 80s peer.
It's hard to argue against Montana, but if you separate the numbers and you look at the greatest pure passer, I don't think there's any way you can argue anybody against Dan Marino.
The debate down here was always Marino versus Montana, and it was, statistics versus rings, and Marino could never win that argument.
I would call it a tie. At one point, Dan Marino held all the important records in passing, period.
I'm wanted. What for, Sheriff? I'm just a 49er looking for a little gold.
Joe Montana had a great defense. Joe Montana had great running backs, had a great offensive line. He had a great coach.
If you don't get what you want, you'll simply throw the ball away.
Montana was great, but if Young puts up the same win-loss record over his career as a Niner, maybe it's more about the supporting cast.
I recall Dan Fouts having a lot of weapons in the 80s on those Charger teams. I recall Dan Marino having a lot of weapons. But yet, where those guys failed, Joe Montana was still able to complete that task. So I don't think that should be a strike against Joe, that he had great players around him.
Let's face it, you win that many Super Bowls, you can't do it without a Hall of Fame legend quarterback, and this guy was the best that there was in the 80s.
To me, the 80s would be defined by the one guy. That's Joe Montana.
I think these rankings are a bunch of crap. I mean, who's making the rankings? What does it matter? Seriously, how are you picking Joe Montana over John Elway under Dan Fouts as opposed to Warren Moon or Terry Bradshaw or, you know what I'm saying?